Here. It's 12:01. I really appreciate you all taking time out of your day to join us for this conversation. Look, there's not a day that goes by where artificial intelligence within media companies is not discussed. Literally, half my conversations with publishers are about this technology, whether that's page views falling or folks trying to figure out how to use it to write articles, which is, from my perspective, a weird use case, but hey, whatever it is. Publishers are all thinking about how this technology impacts their business. Positives, negatives, good, bad, you name it, they're thinking about it. And look, they should, right? They should be thinking about this. It's an innovative technology. It's disruptive. It's changing things. If you've been in the industry for a long time, you might be having some PTSD about the print to digital transformation, and now here we are. So I'm really excited about this, but I think the important thing with any of these conversations is to some extent there is a right and wrong way to look at this technology. How you deploy AI in your business can have a direct impact, not only on your growth and your revenue and your profitability, but on how your readers and advertisers view you and the impact on trust. And I think it's important, especially with the proliferation of AI slop and AI generated content and deep fakes, and do we know if this is real or fake? With all of that going on, it is going to become unbelievably important for us to prove to our audience that they can trust us. And so that's why I'm really looking forward to this webinar. Scott Cunningham is the fractional chief product officer at the Alliance for Audited Media. He has worked in major newsrooms during some seriously large events, hurricanes, the Super Bowl, you name it, the dude's been part of it. He's also built out content management systems and ad systems. And so he, a little bit like myself, has the fun job of getting to talk with dozens of publishers. He gets to see and hear and learn about what they're doing, what's working, what's not, where operators are thinking things will go. And so that's why I'm thrilled, Scott, that you can join us today. So, Scott, welcome.
Thank you. Appreciate it. I'm excited for today as well.
So before we jump in, a couple of quick things. Special thanks to the Alliance for Audited Media for making this webinar possible. For over 100 years, publishers, agencies, and marketers have relied on AAM as its predecessors to set standards and develop assurance programs that bring greater transparency to channels across digital, print, retail media, events, out of home, ad tech, and more. And it's the same with AI. This year, AAM launched its ethical AI certification built on the platform's ethical AI framework, and it addresses key areas such as disclosure, human oversight, privacy, bias, and risk management. Our businesses depend on our readers trusting us, and AAM's ethical AI framework helps provide that trust. To learn more, head over to auditedmedia.com. Some housekeeping rules. Q&A is turned on for this. If, as we are talking, there are things you want to know, ask them, and I will attempt to get all of those questions answered. Um, Someone in the comments okay, cool. Thank you, McKay. So let's jump right in. I want to sort of get a lay of the land. You talk to a lot of publishers, and when the subject of AI comes up, like, what's the mood in the room? Are they excited? Do they feel a massive sense of dread, exhausted, all, nothing? And what's the trend over the past like 12 to 18 months?
It's 12 to 18 months. I would say 18 months ago, because I work with national pubs, I work with local pubs, the local media consortium, and a lot of the pubs within Alliance for Audio Media and just general all around. And I would say that 18 months ago, everyone was kind of in the same spot. It's like, holy shit, there's a lot of fear. We don't know what's going to happen. Our traffic's going to erode. The open web is done, and it's all changing. And we've kind of heard that though before, right? I mean, everyone kind of freaks out initially against these things until they actually kind of say, okay, well, let's dive in and see what we do. And I would say, over the course of 18 months, I've seen some actually I've been somewhat beholden by some of the response coming from the publishers. And sometimes it's driven by the national pubs because they have more resources to lean in and try to figure things out than maybe the smaller ones. But I would say the mood today is much more pragmatic. It's not whether to use AI, or it's kind of where does it make sense, where does it create value on whether it's the content creation side or the business side. I think organizations, by some of them have moved past kind of the hype, and they're treating AI like any other tech investment, and maybe we've learned something, as you noted, from the print to digital transition. Maybe we've learned something over time that we don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past on many fronts. And so, how do we isolate new revenue opportunities, maybe a little bit better, different audiences, and now I think we're in this like, okay, we're in the beginning of AI is about to get real phase. We're not in the mature phase, but it's about to get real. And what do we do with that? And so I'm actually kind of excited where we've gone from 12 to 18 months. And for the first time, I'm starting to think in terms of what are the opportunities? And I'm seeing some more publishers think that way too.
One of my criticisms of any new technology, and I used to work at a crypto media company, so pretty early stage technology and all that. One of my criticisms is a lot of people will say they're using the technology. IBM made a huge amount of noise back in 2017 about blockchain technology. I don't really think it did anything. And then AI came out, they pivoted. Where is AI actually being used today within media companies?
I think it's actually being used in many different scenarios. I've had conversations on a number of fronts, but he also has to think in terms of where's AI been used too? It's not, this isn't necessarily something new. A lot of people in different groups within publishers, product folks, tech folks, they've actually been using machine learning in different AI scenarios for quite some time. It just hasn't, risen to the spotlight that it has today. So I think, in various elements, I've seen AI being used and summarized from a content production perspective, summarizing interviews and transcripts, obviously, in that production flow is almost as a research type of assistant. Where product gets activated a little bit better, I think is like tagging and classifying content, whether it's, for SEO optimization or brand suitable or brand safety type of generation that advertisers really like. Production, creating headlines and social media type of headlines. If you've got one story, but you've got, 20 different distribution channels, what's the right headline that goes with it? I think AI has been activated and leveraged a little bit easier in that. Audience segmentation. I think this one here is actually really exciting to me because I think publishers assumed over time who their audiences were. Obviously, if you've got like a high school sports audience segment, but now can you use AI to generate an audience segment of high school sports and a political aficionado group, and package and bundle that for advertising purposes? Say there's the product implications, but also then obviously on the operations, ad operations, sales operations, just moving quicker in different operating units. So I see it kind of in various buckets, content and business, but I'm seeing infusion of it in various states. So I think it's very healthy, actually.
Is there a particular use case that you've seen that is just like a slam dunk use for AI that you think every publisher should be looking to do?
Well, yeah, I think I separate because I kind of, I wear the product hat, right? Before it was actually cool to call it product. And so you've got like content and you've got business, right? And so I do separate those worlds out because I've said them both. But I'd say on the content side, being able to move quicker in content generation and then the workflow acceleration, I think is huge. In content generation, you have the producer line, especially around web, right? But then you've got the, maybe the investigative journalist side, if you're in the journalism entity and the content creation side, whether it's broadcast or print. Being able to use AI to help you in your production scenario of different elements, but you're not sacrificing the um, the quality of it if you're doing it right, right, and you're doing it ethically responsible. You're actually just accelerating your opportunity to create that content and use it as an advantage from a research utility to help you with your original reporting. And so I don't want to say you're replacing content creation or journalism on that front. That's not what I'm suggesting. I think people, make these fictitious workflows up oftentimes, but you're removing a lot of the administrative work from that production. I think that's where the opportunity is. And candidly, then you're producing probably more content for your customers on that front. That's the content side, the way I think about it.
And so if we pull that thread a little bit, is the ROI for a publisher that sort of really targets in on production, is it a reduction in salary? Is it an increase in the number of stories they can publish because they're not having to do as much work? Like, is it cost savings or is it meaningfully growing revenue?
I think it's all of it, to be quite honest. I think the margin, the P&L look at the way the business, and this is why I actually think that the ROI is faster on the business side when you look at it. If you look at it in totality of the content production, I actually think that the ROI, if you look at it from a business perspective, is actually quite attractive because yes, there's always going to be inherent implications when a new technology comes to market like this, and is part of the fabric of an organization where you're going to find better efficiencies. But I think jobs don't reduce; they just change, and I think we're going to see that across the board. And I think you've been hearing more and more about that, not just publishing industry, but other industries and AI impact. I do think that. The organization, especially the editorial, are going to have a higher quality standard and more governance. I think that's probably very healthy against things. But I will say for the first time, I've seen, and this is in the last 6 to 12 months, just being a part of these conversations, for the first time, I've seen the C-suite really lean in to these things. Whereas, I went through that print to digital transition or the broadcast to streaming transition, right? And which we're kind of gone through, and you've seen some of the old guard say, oh, that's just part of a new distribution channel. Well, no, I've seen now the C-suite lean in much more critically on these areas, and it's not because of a cost savings approach. I actually think they're doing it from a revenue and growth perspective, and I think it's smart. I was a part of a lot of conversations in the summer in Cannes in the advertising conference, but with publisher C-suite executives. And they're taking a look at very new progressive opportunities when it comes to how to transact AI or transact their content with AI engines, and then what the advertising implications are. We've had these conversations for years around advertising impressions. Well, what does it look like to have an advertising impression to an AI engine? I mean, these are all new conversations. So I actually think that the C-suite is taking a look at ROI from a growth and revenue perspective, much more than a cost savings perspective. And I think that's very healthy.
I want to pull on one of those things you just said, which was around AI impressions, because I'm starting to hear more and more conversation around agentic ad buying and and all that. And so, for the publishers in the room, like, what does that mean? Where is that going? What does it mean to deliver an ad impression to a bot? Like, talk through that.
Yeah, this is actually a really fascinating time in the history of, I think, digital. 10 years ago, we created at the industry level. This is after I left publishing and I went to the IAB and created the IAB Tech Lab and created ad standards. And we always created impressions for audiences and humans. We created metrics around things like viewability. And we actually have standards written that says you should not be delivering impressions to bots. No, bots are bad. And think about it now, we've got a whole new world here where I'm talking to publishers, working with publishers, and saying, all right, you've got this piece of content, and this content is then being scraped or ingested into an LLM system. And now you have advertisers going, well, wait a minute, you're a reputable publisher brand. And it feels like your brand is getting favorable score and ranking and weighting by these LLMs. I want to buy this sponsored content or this advertorial or this content marketing piece, wherever you want to call it. More and more brands are saying, hey, look, I want to deliver my content experience under your brand because the LLMs trust your brand. Well, every time an LLM crawls that site or scrapes that site, it's going to pick up that brand content marketing piece. That is what we would call an AI impression. And even in your static, video or display units, you have metadata information. There's content in advertising, and that content's being ingested into the LLM, into the AI engine in itself. That is an AI impression. And honestly, we have no industry metric of how to actually judge the outcome of this. In fact, like I said, we've been saying for 10 years that bots are bad. Now we're actually saying, well, that's not really true anymore. So we're kind of making this up. And candidly, you think about it, that's the value proposition for reputable publishers is to use the credibility that they've earned over the years. And the LLMs recognize that. So how do you create the value around that? And I think that's actually one of the most exciting advances I've seen in the last 12 to 18 months.
So when you're talking to publishers and they're saying either this is going well for us, we're figuring out some real concrete use cases, like the team's getting bought in and all that, or the publisher goes, this is a freaking disaster, we can't get anything going. What did the publishers that have made it work thus far do differently than the ones who have struggled thus far?
Yeah, again, history repeats itself. Those publishers that just start and lean in on the technology, there might be some evangelist internally who's all excited and sits on a committee group call or is an internal resource who says, "Oh my God, did you just see Claude.4.3.8.1 just released and I can do." That's not the way to do it, right? I mean, it's cool. Yeah, you really want that enthusiasm, but it's really the organizations I lean in who I see lean in to take a look at their operational workflow and understand where the friction and the pain points are, and they start asking, the questions on where am I wasting time? Could I actually achieve better results for my customers being quicker on these things or being better on these things than just saying I want to lean into the technology for the sake of technology just to be up with the Joneses. It's really about those operators who actually really understand how to work with their teams and address the pain points, and that's where I've seen the best success stories so far.
And so I kind of want to transition a little bit into some of the hard parts about this. And we do actually have a viewer question about vendor selection. So, Kristen asked, a lot of journalists, I mean, even I think AMO's team use Otter for, transcriptions for when they do their interviews. But if you look at their TOS, it says they use meeting transcripts to train their models. When we think about IP protection, how should publishers be looking at these various vendors when basically everyone wants to train their own model?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Actually, I think it's easy, and actually that was my first response to when I think about just asking that question of don't chase vendor demos for the sake of chasing vendor demos because there's a cool new whiz bang thing here, and I love the fact that you're using this vendor's use case for your workflow. It does come back to contract governance, and I teach publishers and brands this all the time and saying if you're going to sign a contract with a vendor, understand what rights and derivative rights they have to the data that they're getting from you. And I think you're going to want to make sure that legally that you're signing contracts with vendors and understanding what it is and your application and your use case that they're using that data to retrain their model in their system. I would be very uncomfortable signing a contract with any vendor that says, hey, look, we're going to give you this service. We're going to charge you this service. And by the way, we can use all the data that you generate for us to improve our product. I think you need to work with them on that and then ensure that whatever inputs that you're providing there, there's some residual value that you're getting out of it. Is that a price point? Is that hey, we want, sometimes it's sweat equity in a vendor organization against those things. And I wouldn't bat an eye towards asking for more if that's the use case that they're going to use on you.
All right, I want to go back to something you talked about with regard to some of these executive teams are really leaning in versus, the print to digital or the broadcast to streaming. They were just sort of like, whatever, that's a different one. I'm going to sit on the 45th floor, eat my expensive lunch, and not worry about it. Now, like they're really leaning in. What is the human cost that you have found at these publishers with the rollout of this technology? Are people excited? Are people frustrated? I've spoken with some operators who say that one of two scenarios happens. Either their team buys in like right away. And look, it tends to be the product teams, the engineering teams that do that. But then you've got another group of people that are so resistant to this technology, that it almost becomes their identity. I hate AI so much that I refuse to ever consider it ever. Like, talk about that human cost you're seeing.
I mean, is that any different than I hate web or I hate social media or I hate, you know what I mean? I find when I was previously head of Media News Group Interactive, this was many years ago. Our digital division always had to interface with the print operators and the digital operators out in the field, right? And over 200 properties in Media News Group at the time. Now it's even bigger. And I would say those who became resistant to those types of change didn't have jobs after a while. I find that everybody who has a certain job recognizes that they can either recognize that their job is going to change or potentially their job might be eliminated. And those who embrace the fact that their job is going to change are always the ones who survive these types of things. And frankly, it's not just surviving, they thrive. And I find that those who embrace that change actually lean into how to make the most efficient decisions out of those things. So, I think the human cost here is the calculus has always been those who resist it. And trust me, we've always, for the last 30 years for me, I've ran into those in the print and broadcast worlds across the board who resist that change. And, they kind of drag down the business. And so I've actually seen more and more of again, the C-suite actually embrace that change. I've actually now heard C-suite operators recently start in the last year, and some of this has been public, say, hey, look, we're gonna idle our web output. We're just gonna maintain the CPMs. We're gonna maintain the revenue on web. We're gonna maintain, but we're gonna lean into AI over here. And so these four other categories, we're gonna lean into growth while maintaining web. And who would have said that? 5, 6 years ago, we're going to maintain our web experience, and then lean in. They all would have been like, "Look, are you kidding? We have to grow web. We have to go." Now they're talking about maintaining certain advances we made in the last 10 years in order to lean in on other growth opportunities. That to me, quite candidly, screams attack. And I've not heard C-suite publishers talk that way in years and years to think about how to go on offense. So I actually think that those that you're citing here, the ones that are going to be the expendable employees, are the ones who are going to say, no, we got to play defense. And I just don't think this is the time to do that.
Do you think that for all publishers, like peak web is behind us?
I think it's changed. I won't say peak because I think web is changing because now we're talking about two experiences. They're the publishers who we've always created the last 10 to 15 years. What's the best web experience we could
Mhm.
possibly get and obtain customers? Now, I will say that in the era of how we've been trying to monetize, we've probably abused that consumer experience. Some of the websites out there, quite candidly, folks, I got to tell you, some of them look like the Vegas Strip with all the ads you got. This is how you've ended up in the MFA conversation, the made for arbitrage, made for advertising conversation, your reputable brands. But now we're entering in a new phase where we've got actual humans and then what we'll call the page behind the page or the experience behind the experience. We have two experiences now, one that's human centric, one's AI centric. And how do we actually produce content for the machines and then advantage ourselves for the machines from a revenue perspective and as alongside the consumer perspective? So I think that I don't know, maybe I'm an optimist because I've always believed in the web, but I actually think that the best is in front of us, quite candidly.
So where are you seeing publishers get burned right now? Like what are the failure modes that you see most often?
Mm, I would say right now, publishers are getting burned because they haven't figured out how to work with the LLMs. Um, there's publishers out there, and you're starting to read the headlines where, and I've mentioned this in a lot of my committees and speeches recently, 30 to 50,000 scrapers a day hitting their websites. And so they're getting burned because the web has been this unique distribution channel. If you think about publishers who distribute on newsletters, or you distribute in your mobile app, or if you're a broadcaster in your CTV app, by and large, those are enclosed environments. It's hard to get your content. Whereas a website, it's easy to extract. If you think about Google search appliance, they're indexing the content. We know this. Every publisher's been talking about this. You've been anchoring your business and maybe your referral traffic to SEO. Well, how did Google get that content? They were scraping and crawling and ingesting that into their system. Well, now we've got 30 to 50,000 scrapers a day, and they're coming from all parts of the globe. In fact, a lot of scrapers are activating on your content in different areas of the world, whether it's Eastern Europe or Southeast Asia, and you have no audience there. So what are they doing? They're training their own systems and their own models against your content. That's number one. Number two, Publishers are starting to recognize while looking at this that there's a lot of activity and activation against their content, against their advertising inventory, people representing their advertising inventory. We call this private marketplaces and the programmatic systems. Those who are on the ad side know this. You're starting to recognize there's a lot of people monetizing your content, your audience, and your ad inventory without your knowledge. And it's all done through scrapers. So if you're going to make and lean in to the new world of, I would say, the value proposition of your content licensing or your ad monetization, audience monetization, you have to start shutting off and looking at those scrapers because you're getting burned by that. You want to make money off your licensing agreements. You're thinking about these things. People are talking about them. Look, you're not going to make any money off of it if it's actually for free. You have to create scarcity of supply. And if you're not thinking about how to shut off those scrapers, then you're not going to be able to monetize effectively.
So let's pull on that though a little bit because, I'm pretty sure Sam at OpenAI said recently that they're not looking to do many, many more licensing deals.
Yeah.
That's one like major player that's not going to do licensing deals. Now that could be just a negotiating tactic. But in the long tail of media, they're never going to get a licensing deal. So, are you seeing any success from some of these marketplaces that are popping up that are effectively representing publishers to do, okay, so I block, let's say, Scott, you've got an LLM, I block Scott LLM, but you really want access to my content, but you and I are not going to sit down with lawyers and do a thing because, neither of us are billionaires. So you go through the marketplace. Like, is that working for anyone?
Yeah, it's early stages. I'm not hearing tremendous success on the marketplaces. Now, obviously, this is new. So let me walk through a couple, scenarios here where the Ivy Tech Lab just released this summer the content monetization protocol. So that's actually a standard by which marketplaces are trying to look at. Excuse me. But if you're a publisher and you are participating in a marketplace, let's say you're not a big publisher, and you're right. I'm not big enough. I'm not going to be able to sign a licensing deal with OpenAI, like some of the big brand publishers maybe that are out there. And so you're like, well, let me try my hand in a consolidated marketplace. Those consolidated marketplaces are still relatively new. And I do think they're going to be vertical based. So if you've got a vendor out there, though, that it's basically saying, hey, look, we've got a marketplace. We're going to help you block. We're going to then help you license and monetize. Okay, that's great. What's the residual value I'm getting out of it? What price point? And am I just kind of being cohabitated with a bunch of publishers who are the same size, or is it the same content vertical? So there's still a lot there to be figuring out. At the same time, I'm not suggesting either that you go in with the sledgehammer approach and then block all scrapers by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, the IAB, not the Tech Lab, but the IAB actually just released this summer too. I think it's called like the IAB AI Visibility Measurement Framework. And it basically allows brands and publishers to kind of figure out how to work with vendors and how to maximize their score, if you will, in an LLM. So it might be that, you are only allowing scraping on a 24-hour TTL, for example, or maybe it's once a week. So you're kind of feeding it what it needs at that time to get the value and the benefit you're getting out of it. Again, this is all new territory. So I don't want to say that just because the marketplace today around this, vertical over here isn't working, it might in the year. But if you're not thinking about how to at least control and monitor all those scrapers, you're not going to get value of it. Just letting exposure happen in all your content, you're never going to be able to sell, license, or even candidly probably manage the scoring and value you're getting out of your brand within the LLMs. You have to think about how to actually shut off and put the controls in place, and if you're going to be successful on the monetization on the other side of it.
It's a viewer question, but as discovery shifts from search engines to AI generated answers, what should, magazine publishers or publishers kind of at large be doing now to ensure their content brands and subject matter expertise remains visible? And how should we measure whether those efforts are working?
Yeah, so this goes to the heart of the AI visibility measurement framework that Ivy put out there. They've actually put out a really good framework that we could probably circulate out there to folks in order for publishers to actually think about how to measure the success they're getting out of the LLM. So that's a great place to start. I would also, though, think about this. I mean, there's like a bunch of layers. There's a few layers here. Decide what content environments are are worth, right? So you maybe have section fronts and then you have content article pieces, right? And so are you allowing the fronts in order to be scraped and they're only getting bite-sized information? What value are you getting out of the LLMs on that versus a full URL article, right? How much content are you feeding it? Are you giving it a couple paragraphs? You can control these scenarios. And so right now, I would say this is playtime, this is experimentation time against those things, but you need to make sure that you're staffing these things accordingly and putting the right strategies in place in order to experiment on these things based on what to block and what to not block against those things. So I would start with, what's the visibility framework of around that measurement? Again, it's new, it's all new out there, but there are some guidelines and best practices out there how to monitor these things. But then it's going to require you all as publishers to make sure you're leaning in and experimenting on these things because there's not one right answer to any of this right now. But I do think that uh, versus what we saw with SEO and search engine. Is this the new SEO? Is this the new revenue time monetization? Is this the new what we would call the addiction here of traffic referral? I actually think we should look at it very differently in many respects. And the reason is because I think for the first time, we're starting to see the LLMs really favor your brands. And I'm sure all of you on the call have those brands. They're starting to favor you all as a score of trustworthiness out there. And you need to make sure you're leaning in on that trustworthiness so that the LLMs are thinking about your brand and your website domain as a trustworthy source of input and ingest. And then understand the leverage you might have in that and then figure out how to monetize it from there. I think that's the difference that I've seen now versus with SEO and search.
So you talk about trust, and I said this at the top. Audience trust is the thing that a media company has that most random social content creators might not have just simply because of legacy. Um, but once you have that trust, once you lose that trust, it's really hard to go back, right? And it starts to become like almost like a death spiral where like you lose the trust, you start to do things in a way to try to get it back, and you only do worse, and then just bad decisions kind of uh, build on each other. Where's the line, in your opinion, between using AI to work faster, more efficiently, for cost savings, for revenue growth, all of those things, and using it in a way that erodes that trust?
Yeah, this is the I mean, everyone's trying to look at this, and not when I mean everyone, like even regulatory bodies are looking at this as well, the national and obviously state levels against these things. So I would say um, AI should improve content, not impersonate it. It's kind of like my standard line. There are exceptions where you're going to use AI, and coming from the publishing world, think about stock tickers, think about sports tickers. You think about AI generating two paragraphs based on summaries of data inputs against those things. And I think that's okay as long as you're disclosing and declaring it to the user. The consumer is essentially looking for authenticity. And I think we've been preaching that now for like the last 6 to 12 months. They're just looking for transparency and authenticity against these things. And I think that if you're using AI to draft a summary of something or a headline, as long as you're disclosing and declaring that to the consumer, I think you're going to be okay. I think that if you're using AI to generate like 100% of an image or a photograph, you need to disclose and declare that. And I'll get into the reason why we've come up with some of our thinking here in a minute. But um, if you're using AI to like and the best example here is a photo and a magazine photo. You used Adobe software to airbrush an image, of a cover. You didn't really tell the customer and the consumers out there that, hey, we used Adobe software to airbrush this image. You didn't have to go to that level. I think AI is a little bit different. I don't think you need to label that at the content piece of that because you still have a lot of human generated, but I think you need to disclose that in your probably general policies. Um, and in fact, we started thinking about this from the ethical AI perspective at Alliance for Audio Media over a year ago. Some of the publishers reached out. USA Today in particular led the drive on this, and Gannett, back when it was called Gannett, but now USA Today, to the point where now the New York State Legislature has passed what's called I'm going to butcher this, but I think it's called the Fundamental Artificial Intelligence Requirement Act. They call it the Fair and News Act. Basically, it's the first state legislation I've seen pushed that forces publishers to disclose to consumers their use of AI, and it's sitting in front of the governor's desk now. It's expected to be signed here in November or December. And I think other states are going to follow that type of legislation, like California. And why is this all important? Well, it's the first time I've seen journalism or content creation and some regulatory element try to look at this thing to make sure that consumers aren't duped. But I see that as a massive opportunity, actually, because those publishers who cannot conform to that, um, where I would call that like AI slop. And I just did a big report for the ANA and Association of National Advertisers released this week and TAG that talked about AI slop. Those reputable publishers, all of them on this call, now have an opportunity, though, to conform to a disclosure and transparency requirement. That it's going to be regulation, but with the ethical AI certification AM, that is actually kind of the foundational element. Are you disclosing that? Is that icon there that said this has been assured and independently validated that you are disclosing and declaring your use of AI in these systems? By doing that, I think you're earning that trust. You're creating that authentic relationship that a consumer says, okay, look, I've always trusted you, but now I trust you even more because I know that you're actually taking steps to produce that content and you're communicating to me in a way that you're using AI, but you're not abusing the senses of me being a customer on that. And I think that's where you're going to win as a legitimate publisher.
So it's funny, my job is to kind of cover what's going on for media businesses. And up until you and I spoke right before this, I had not heard of. I live in New York. I had not even heard of this bill. So this is the New York Fair News Act, New York Fundamental Artificial Intelligence Requirements and News Act. There is nothing more hilarious than listening to a politician name a bill. Um, Now, from what I understand about this bill, even if you're not a publisher in New York, you are still, if you've got a New York audience, you still have to follow this rule. What is the consequence of not following the rule?
I think honestly it's to be determined. I think that they've built in there some fines, but let's take a step back on the consequence. Let's talk about how they're going to try to enforce. This is interesting because I think that very similar to what we saw privacy regulation in California and different state regulations across the U.S. There's been a lot of advocacy and lobbying in Washington for federal privacy regulation. Well, now we're seeing those big AI engines out there lobbying heavily for federal government, because it's very hard to scale state regulatory requirements if you're a business entity. So if you're a publisher, let's say you're a publisher in LA, a large newspaper in LA, we all know the name, and let's say you have New York audiences. You are required to actually disclose to the New York audiences your use of AI, even if your content is in LA. So what are you going to do? Are you going to shut off all New York audiences? I mean, yeah, a lot of US publishers shut off European audiences around GDPR because they're like, look, it's less than 0.5%. Quite candidly, me trying to be in compliant with GDPR and European privacy regulations not even worth my dime. So some publishers just said, you know what, you're coming from Europe, you're blocked. You're not going to be able, I'm not even going to play this game with you. Are we going to do that with AI and content consumption? No, so I think, but if you take a look at a couple scenarios, one, if the governor signs this, which is looking like she's expected to do, then the New York AG has to figure out, well, all right, well, how the hell am I going to enforce that? He or she is going to have to figure out, well, how many doors are we going to knock on to say, hey, do you have the appropriate disclosures and stuff if you're a publisher or you're a creator somewhere? And I've got New York audiences. So I actually think this is an opportunity for self-regulatory environments like AAM. And the reason why we started this conversation and what we did with AAM was we started the conversation with the New York legislature on this, and just recent, to say, hey, look, is there a possibility here to amend this, or at least put in a citation that says if you are a publisher or content provider and you've gone through the certification by AAM, will you recognize that? And I gotta think, and this is early conversations, but I gotta think that any AG would be like, frankly, all I got to do is look for this independent self-regulatory certification because all we're really talking about is disclosure and transparency. And this group here is audited for that. In fact, if you're a member of AAM, it's free to go through the certification. So if we can get the state regulators to actually recognize this program, I think it's going to create and reduce a lot of friction by which these state regulatory environments are entering into because there's no freaking way they're going to be able to govern this from a compliance perspective. I can't see it unless they've got partners within the industry like AAM.
And ironically adds incremental costs to the publishers having to deal with if every single state kind of rolls this out, having to manage all of those, regulatory frameworks, and each one might be slightly different, really kind of becomes quite annoying. Which, we've all worked at big companies. If someone's job is not this thing, no one's going to do it. It's just a fact of life. You got to say this is someone's job, or no one takes the responsibility. So, in your opinion, when it comes to this sort of ethical use of AI, whose job at a media company is it to kind of hold up the banner on this is the way to do it?
I mean, some companies have, their AI lead, if you will, but quite candidly, I mean, it has to be product editorial leadership. I mean, everybody has to own this because it'd be kind of like saying, hey, look, we are an organization, we've got technology and this thing called technology, and should we use technology and one person owns technology? I mean, we know that doesn't scale and work. I think AI is so influential that you're going to have to do this at the executive level across the board and make sure every department head is accountable against these things. So you're all working in lockstep. I think that product editorial understands trust. Managing editors have always understood trust. Executive producers of broadcast inherently have always tried to create content so that it was trustworthy. And I think product teams understand workflows. They understand consumer growth and business growth, and technology folks understand the implementation. Your legal teams understand risk, right, and compliance, and so they're going to look for general latitude, but obviously want to be compliant. Especially, it's to your point here. Um, just because New York is out there and California is going to come around, we're going to find that there's going to be 4 or 5 states are probably going to lead the way, and everybody else is going to, all the other states. So hopefully it scales somewhat okay. But the legal team is going to have to get their arm around these things. And then, the revenue teams are obviously going to have to understand the commercial opportunities against these things. So I wouldn't say there's one person. I do find that some organizations are anointing one person, but I think that's probably just because they need someone internally to make sure that all the other department stakeholders are held accountable internally. And I think that's okay. But as long as somebody just doesn't say, hey, this person's tasked with this, they're going to come back to us in 6 months with a, now it can't operate that way. I actually think that this is a huge opportunity for most publishers to lean in on. And obviously, the larger ones I think are doing a good job. It's going to be the small and medium sized ones that probably going to need a little bit more hand holding just because they're not big enough to make sure that they're pivoting fast enough on certain things. But candidly, they're not going to have the overhead of large departments either on that. So this is the opportunity for the transition.
We have another viewer question. With regard to disclosures, can we simply include AI use in our disclosures and terms and conditions page to meet these requirements, or is that not enough?
It's close to enough. What we're saying in the AM ethical AI and the transparency is that if you've got a piece of content, so what we would like to see, and this is part of the program, is you have a ethics policy around AI. You obviously have a privacy policy, you have other policies centrally. What we want to see here when you go through our certification is this little AM icon in the footer of the page that yes, you've been independently audited. However, if you have a piece of content that clearly is 100% synthetic, label that at the content source, right? We don't think if you all are reputable publishers, there's too much of that, right? Like I said, that stock ticker, that high school sports, and you've got some content that's being generated and it's synthetic and 2 paragraphs written. Label that at the content source of those things if it's 100% of that, just because you're going to want to earn that trust. But generally speaking, almost all of your operations are going to have certain elements. Maybe this is the opportunity to talk about, the different pillars we got here. Transparency and disclosure and that labeling to the listener's question is one of those pillars. The policies and governance. The rights and permissions in that ethical use AI policy, we're going to want to make sure that you are using all the rights and permissions of that content input. You're going to want to communicate to your consumer that you've got a human in the loop and the right oversight, accountability, the bias and fairness, that you are accounting for the privacy and data protection of the consumers in that type of AI use. And then communicate the training and risk management against these things and the ethical policies. Those are really the 8 pillars of AAM's program. And I think that, to really drill in on this, that we've had good spirited debates with publishers on how much is too much against this. And if you're using a little bit of AI for content and headline writing, you don't need to disclose and declare that every single source there. That doesn't scale either. So that's a central declaration is the way I look at it. But if it's 100% synthetic, you're going to want to do right by your customers on that and just make sure they understand that.
We have another viewer question, and I think this sort of goes to it's an engineering question almost around like the whole vibe coding kind
Yeah.
of kind of behavior. So AI is democratizing app building so effectively that everyone can create their own solutions. But that same speed means we're accumulating tools no one fully understands, some possibly mishandling data or skipping security review. How do you balance that innovation velocity against the growing governance risk?
I think if you're putting it in a production site, I mean, obviously there's experimentation. And so like I'm going to wear my former M&GI hat here because I had all the software teams and outsourced operations teams and ad ops and you name it. I think if you are actually in experimentation phase, and yeah, I've built my own Claude apps as well. And, I was actually a really good technical architect. I sucked at coding. Claude has actually made it freaking great. But the question becomes, did you put it into production scenarios? If you're putting a piece of software into an actual daily production scenario, that's where you're going to need some independent internal review. I actually think we're going to end up in a system not too far away where these AI application systems are going to probably fall under like SOC compliance, right? So you're going to end up as an organization going through a SOC 2 type 2 compliance. It's going to be under your technical fiscal type of organization. I think AI is probably going to end up being bundled into that. That's going to be a little bit different than what we're talking about from the editorial content perspective. But I would actually say if you're really up to speed as an organization and you're putting some of these Claude apps into production, I would actually, if you really want to get in front of it, yeah, you don't want to put too many barriers of entry into the innovation cycle, but I would have someone internally review the control structure of your SOC compliance and see what type could form there, and just to see if you're in compliance on that SOC type of compliance. Because I think that candidly, what's going to happen here in the next 5 to 10 years is you're going to see a lot more controls built around AI that would be take a look at that SOC process.
So every time we talk about AI, time flies. And believe it or not, we are right there at the end of our conversation. But I do want to end with one quick question for you because I like for operators to kind of walk away with one thing that they should be thinking about. So for a media operator that's watching this, who wants to do like one thing differently Monday morning, right? They're going to distill this tomorrow, and Monday morning they're going to come in and they're going to start somewhere. What should it be?
Um, I mean, I go back to what history has taught us in this evolution here. Don't start with ChatGPT, right? I've actually I've actually seen now what we'll call AI slop report, but I've seen reputable publishers have articles on their page. And at the very bottom of this, I've had verification vendors show me this. It says, now, at the very last sentence under a byline, it says, now, would you like me to go do this? Meaning somebody somewhere copied and pasted their ChatGPT inputs and then put it on a web page and with a byline. Clearly, the author did not write that. It was ChatGPT, and that's the danger. That's a slippery slope of these things. So I wouldn't start with the whiz bang evolution of ChatGPT or Claude or anything like that. I would start with two scenarios. What's your operating workflow and the friction you experienced? How can you get things done more efficiently? I would go back to that. Am I spending more hours tagging content? Am I spending more hours research? Am I spending more hours, moving between two information systems? Use AI for those opportunities, and then candidly, I think some of the publishers who are gonna, how I said, some of the publishers in the next 5 years who are gonna be the most successful, or they're not going to be the ones who use AI the most. I think they're the ones who combine AI with models that the candidate models can't replicate. What is a trusted brand? What is original content? What's your strong editorial judgment? What's your transparency and governance? Create those direct relationship with your customers and talk to them about your use of AI. I think those are the ones who are going to be, and that's where it starts for me. Start thinking along those lines, and then use AI to help you get to that point versus just jumping all in and say, "Oh my gosh, we should start using ChatGPT tomorrow," because why? You haven't really asked why.
Scott, that is all the time we have for today. I really appreciate you coming on and kind of walking through some of the stuff with us. Some things I did not even know, and like I said, it's my job to know it, so I appreciate that. Thank you to the Alliance for Audited Media for making this webinar possible. As publishers, the only thing we have is our readers' trust, and when that goes away, it is hard to get it back. So if you're already using AI or thinking about how it fits your business, I encourage you to check out AAM's Ethical AI certification. Head over to auditedmedia.com to learn more. One final note, if you are thinking about attending the AMO Summit this year, ticket prices increase after tomorrow, so register now. Go to amosummit.com. And as always, thank you so much for listening. If you have feedback, you can email me at jacob@amediaoperator.com. Tell me this was great. Tell me this was horrible. We want to hear from you. It's Thursday afternoon. I hope you all have a great rest of your day and weeks. Talk soon.